Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to today's workshop. My name is Jacquelyn Sundberg, and I work here at McGill with the ROAAR group in the library. That stands for Rare Books and Special Collections, the WWII Library of the History of Medicine, the Visual Arts Collection, and Archives and Records Management. Thanks for joining us today for Knitting 101. I'll be leading today's workshop along with two colleagues who you see on screen here. You can give a wave. I'll give you proper introductions in a minute, but we have Kristen Howard and April Colosimo today. And welcome to all of you. But this one is an important one. I'm joining you, and so is Kristen today from the downtown campus of McGill. And McGill University is located on lands that have long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. ROAAR and McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which McGill stands today, and on which we get to connect over ideas and exchange patterns, stitches, and a look into historical knitting content today. The other thing I want to mention is that this event is part of the virtual sustainable events program at McGill. So we applied and we're careful in planning it. And we did get that certification, and we're proud of putting in that effort. So the next thing I will do is introduce my two co-presenters properly, Kristen Howard and April, and I actually, for the occasion, we're all wearing hand knits. So we are all enthusiastic knitters and librarians, or librarian in training. Kristen is currently doing her Master's of Information Studies here at McGill, and she is a historian by education, and we'll be hearing some of the crossover of the love of libraries, knitting, and history today. April is a liaison librarian here at McGill. She has a number of different areas of responsibility, but she is the liaison for continuing studies, I believe, and the McGill Center for Lifelong Learning. And she is a skilled and super speedy knitter, and you'll be impressed by the products she put together today. It's been a pleasure to collaborate with her for today's workshop. So on that note, you'll see on screen what's coming up for today. We're going to do a presentation portion, and then we're going to have 2 sessions of breakout rooms. So you'll be able to choose the breakout that you want to attend. Kristen is going to be leading one, I'll be leading one, and April will be leading one. So you'll get a choice when that comes up, which one you want to take part in, covering different things. But to kick it off, we'll start with a bit of a presentation on historical knitting patterns and the way that they've changed over the last 200-ish years. We're going to start with the Victorian period. And although knitting, of course, existed long before that, we're not going to go through the full history of the craft with null binding and the early origins of knitting, unless Kristen wants to venture into that territory. I won't. We're going to go back only as far as the Victorians, partly because it's a time when patterns start to look a little bit like they do today. There is the origins of the modern knitting pattern come from that period. And at the time, advances in printing meant that publications of manuals, books, and pamphlets was much less expensive and therefore more readily available. And there was an increase, of course, in women's handiwork, in particular in needlework, embroidery, crochet, and knitting as a pastime for a different strata of women. Guides like this one that you see on screen were often published anonymously. As you see here, this one was published by a lady or pseudonymously. The Work Woman's Guide containing instructions to the inexperienced in cutting out and completing those articles of wearing apparel which are usually made at home. This particular example we accessed through the McGill Library catalog. We don't have the physical item, but we have access to the digital surrogate. This one is from the University of California's collections. That's where the original lives. Next, Victorian knitting patterns from this early period, the 1830s to 1850s, look very different from the patterns that we see today. And we'll show you a few examples. Kristen's nodding. They're hard to follow for a modern knitter who's familiar with the way that patterns are laid out today. So we're going to look at some of the differences that these early patterns have, and then also a few commonalities. So one of the things that hasn't changed are the tools. So on screen here, the tools have not really changed. The fundamentals remain the same. This author from that same Work Woman's Guide describes the most common tools at the time. So knitting pins or needles, which were made of iron brass for common use, and steel for best, is what you see on screen here. This author also gives a price point for where or what these might cost for an average woman, and also where you might procure them from a carpenter or wood turner if you went with an alternative substance like wood, ebony, or ivory, or even whalebone. Those you won't find as much anymore. Contemporary knitters tend to prefer the lightweight metal needles, or wood or bamboo is very popular in recent times. But these early patterns really did look quite different. There are a few illustrations, no carefully posed photos. There's not the expected formula of materials, gauge, size, swatch, and specific instructions that contemporary 21st century knitters might expect. So learning to knit with the Victorians would definitely be a different experience. There's a level I've found of assumed knowledge that is very high. They did, though, increasingly have access to pamphlets and instructional books like this example. This one's from the McGill Collections. It has been digitized and it's up on the Internet Archive in our holdings. And this one, it's palm sized, and I'll show this one later on in one of the breakout sessions, the actual item. But there's general instructions that you see on screen here that are actually quite disorienting. If you try and read along and follow the historical instructions, it's very easy to get into a tangle very quickly. So for those of you who know how to cast on, as you read through this, you take the material, they're referring to the yarn, in your right hand, twisting it around your little finger, bring it under the next two, over your forefinger, take the end in the left hand, and you get lost very quickly. It made me really appreciate YouTube and the tutorials that are available to us today that would not have been available to the Victorian women. But a lot of women would have learned this skill from a female friend, an aunt, a mother, a grandmother, and the level of assumed knowledge is very high. So they would come into this and be like, oh, I recognize things that they already know how to do. So that's what one of the manuals looks like. But the pattern itself is also a solid block of text. As you see here, this is a pattern for stockings, and I'll put up a couple of different examples for stockings because there's a lot of those available at the time. So the sharing of knowledge that was passed from mother to daughter or grandmother to aunt, this is the way that knowledge would have been shared. There's an assumed knowledge base that would help you navigate this pattern. It doesn't have any of the layout options that make pattern reading easy with contemporary patterns. There's no indentation, there's no bolded sections, there's no formatting that helps. But that would get you a workable stocking if you could follow the pattern all the way through. There's an excellent resource that is freely available online on the Internet Archive called the Knitting Reference Library. It's a digitized collection of materials from the University of Southampton. And we'll provide links in the follow-up message, and you can feel free to explore. But some of the materials that I will show you after this are from that collection. This one here is from the University of Southampton, and it's a manual. Oh, sorry, this one is a pattern for stockings, once again, by Miss Ryder. Contains general instructions for stockings, ladies' rib stockings, and gentlemen's knickerbockers as well. This one dates from 1865, which is about 20 years after the example I just showed you from McGill's collection. And it looks more familiar. For those of you who are familiar with what contemporary patterns look like, this one is more familiar. There's different layers, there's indentation, there's an indication of what kind of wool to use at the top. So ladies' stockings ribbed in merino wool. There's an indication of needle size and what kind of fabric you're creating, so a ribbed knit fabric. It also gives, this book provides historians with some fruitful content in that it gives the cost of different materials and needles as well. So tracing the development of the industry, patterns like these ones actually give some important information. This one gives you the two patterns side by side. So that's the one on the left is the McGill pattern for stockings, 1840s, and on the right is 1865. You can see there's not a lot that's different. The terminology is still the same. The technique is the same, but the presentation has improved a little bit. Moving up, this one is also from 1865 and the University of Southampton's holdings. And this one gives price points and for specific kinds of materials. So imperial knitting silk for stockings would cost you 3 shillings for a 2-ounce skein in 1865. I think that would be a little bit more expensive today for those of you fiber hunters out there. Knitting pins, you get the cost, you can see there as well. There's a marked difference in this one. There's actually different fibers, phylocell, for instance, and embroidery silk and knitting pins. Those are the ones listed here. The instructions for this stocking are quite general. And the level of assumed knowledge is still quite high in this example. But one of the things that we can compare is the terminology from that 19th century era with today. A lot of them are very similar. Some of the terminology has changed in the Victorian patterns. To increase was called to raise, decreasing was called narrowing, yarn over was called bringing thread forward in some of the patterns, and no standardized language seemed to exist across all of the different examples. But there are, of course, I'm sure, many people who have created such comparisons. This is just based on the examples that we're showing today. This is another example from later, 1886, Needlework for Ladies for Pleasure and Profit, published in London. The title shows an interesting shift in attitude, that they're now marketing this not only as a refined pastime, but also as a way of making some money. Looking at the pattern, you can see that the formatting aside, it's not far off from a legible pattern for a modern knitter, as it gives you recommended needles, recommended fibers, step-by-step, line-by-line, row-by-row instructions. We don't yet see garment measurements or a gauge direction or a standard layout, but it is not far off from a contemporary pattern. This example is from 1894, a little bit later, and it's interesting, and I include it here because it begins with abbreviations, an explanation of the abbreviations used in a pattern. And that's getting closer to what we see in the 20th century and today. So you can see K is an abbreviation for knit plain and knit stitch. N is to narrow, still using that older terminology, knit 2 stitches together. Purl is purler seam, PN is purling 2 seams together, and so on and so forth. It makes it a little bit easier, and the level of assumed knowledge is now coming down. So there's an explanation for the uninitiated on how to use the pattern. I'll pass it over to Kristen.
Thanks, Jacquelyn. So hi, everybody. I'm assuming that my microphone is working. Awesome. Thank you, Jacquelyn. So the World Wars is kind of the era where I get to be pretty interested in the patterns and what we see. So the first 2 things that I have to show you here aren't patterns, of course, but instead these are knitting propaganda posters. So these are from the American Red Cross, and of course the United States entered World War I later than other countries, and there was already a big knitting relief effort happening in other countries, but the American Red Cross really kind of jumped on board and did some things that we weren't seeing as much of at the time in the UK, for example, or in Canada. And the American Red Cross really wanted to inform non-fighting citizens, and women in particular, how they could contribute to the war effort. And the Red Cross started to create not just these beautiful posters, but also knitting patterns. And I think maybe more importantly, they started to create supplies so that everybody could have access to what they would need to knit for soldiers for free. So anybody would be able to go to a local Red Cross chapter and pick up the items that they would need. And they would know that they could do this because they were seeing these posters. So Jacquelyn, if you want to go to the next slide. So this is a 1918 version of an American Red Cross sweater poster that was sweater pattern that was first created in 1917. And so here we can see how kind of far this pattern has come from some of the Victorian examples. So it was really important for the American Red Cross and other knitting relief organizations to create standardized patterns because they wanted all of the men, all of the soldiers who were wearing these items to have the same things. They wanted the soldiers to look like they were in uniform and not like they were all wearing individual hand knit sweaters like Jacquelyn, April, and I are wearing today. So this pattern includes a specific yarn, the yarn that the Red Cross would supply to someone who wanted to knit it. And it also gives a needle size. It does not give tension or gauge. So we're not quite seeing that yet. Instead, what we're seeing is an assumption that everyone is going to knit the exact same gauge if they use the same yarn and the same needle. And I can tell you that when my mom and I use the same yarns and the same needle, we don't always get the same fabric. So this, we don't quite see gauge yet, but we can kind of see why that might be important soon. And the other thing I'd like to point out here is that knitting needle sizes were not yet standardized, specifically in the US. So in Britain, we start to see the kind of standard millimeter sizes emerging sooner than the kind of interesting US knitting needle sizes that we see today. But they hadn't quite emerged yet in the form that they are now. And so what the Red Cross did is they issued their own needle sizes, sizes 1, 2, and 3. And so we see here that you need to use the Red Cross needle size 3. And it also gives you this handy image of what the needle will look like and how big the diameter should be, perhaps in case you were using needles not from the Red Cross. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that all of the Red Cross patterns were intended to be easy to knit, no matter how much experience you had. So there was little seaming, little shaping, and little finishing. So they were intended to be just as easy as possible. Okay, so then I think if we go on to the next one, we're in the interwar period. And Jacquelyn, this is for you, right?
Yeah. And I included this one partly because I'll show on the next slide. This is actually from an early edition of Chatelaine magazine. And this was from, as you see on screen here, it's from 1928. And it's a pattern that's based off of one of those standardized World War I knitting patterns, which was for a knitted hood. So that one of those patterns, not the one that you just showed, Kristen, but one of these standard items from that Red Cross movement was a knitted hood that the soldiers could wear underneath their helmets. And this baby bonnet is an adaptation with frills and a nicer substance and a different gauge, of course, but it's an adaptation of that 1918 World War I pattern. And it's published now, as so many patterns started to be, in a magazine, in periodicals aimed and targeted at women specifically. And Chatelaine has a long run, and you can explore all of that on microfilm if you want to, but there are digitized copies of that in a lot of libraries as well. But this one, you can see the difference as well. This one's aimed at a general audience. It's illustrated with photos, so the knitter wouldn't have to imagine what the finished project would look like based on their reading of the pattern. They actually had visuals, and that was an important change, I think, for that interwar period.
So then when we enter World War II, there were a lot of relief organizations that had already had this experience in creating patterns from World War I that was carried over. And I would argue, and I would need to do a bit more research to be sure of this, but it seems to me that we really start to see this increased standardization that we kind of expect now really come to bear during this World War II period. And now we have the American Red Cross creating patterns, we have the Canadian Red Cross creating patterns, and they're being distributed even more widely after all the people who had learned in World War I kind of continued on. My light just turned off in here, but I don't think that that changed anything for anybody else. Okay, great. I chose this in particular of the Canadian Red Cross era kind of patterns because this one actually isn't from the Canadian Red Cross, but is instead from Monarch, which was a yarn company. So we're increasingly seeing yarn companies advertising their own patterns as a way to sell their yarn. The other thing I think is pretty interesting about this is the image on the left is the cover. And you'll notice that none of the men on the cover are wearing a knit item, although this is a knitting pattern booklet. You can kind of see that in order to advertise knitted items, you don't even need to necessarily show them as much as show who they are for. The other thing that's interesting about this particular booklet is that it's made to have knits for men and women in service. So we increasingly see that women aren't just staying at home or working the jobs that men can't do, but women are also on the war front in World War II, far more than they were in World War I. And the pattern that I pulled out and put a snippet of on this slide is a unisex pullover. And it's notably one that doesn't have sleeveless vest. It's quite attractive one. There are images of a man and woman modeling this pullover inside of the booklet. And we see here not only the suggested yarn, but also standardized needle sizes, and we see gauge. So gauge is becoming increasingly important, which I think is one of the most important, perhaps, things that we can see coming out in knitting patterns, because everyone needs to know what gauge to knit to in order to have the finished object that they expect. And this is something that Jacquelyn and I kind of pulled out together from an almanac in the collection here at McGill. And so this almanac happens to have some knitting patterns inside of it, some that are intended for soldiers, for example, but there are also a number of baby items in this as well. And here we can see that amongst the other interesting information in this pamphlet, we have this little snippet of a knitting pattern, and it continues on another page, and then it continues on another page, and then it continues on another page. So it's not quite as convenient as the patterns that we expect today, or that we want in magazines, or when we download them and print them. You have to kind of rifle through this entire thing. But again, we can see that we're told what color to make these, what yarn to use, what needles to use, and the measurements and tension for the gauge. So again, we're seeing this increased standardization, even in patterns that aren't specifically intended for soldiers, for war knitting. When I also wanted to point out in here, sorry, Jacquelyn, that the needles were described as pointed at both ends. So that's a really clear, I think, but more cumbersome way to say double pointed needles. But I remember the first time I heard the term double pointed needles, and I couldn't puzzle out what it meant until I saw the item myself. So I think maybe pointed at both ends is a bit more clear if you haven't heard the term before. Okay.
Hey, hi everyone, and thanks Kristen and Jacquelyn. It's so interesting to see these old patterns. So what I wanted to do is introduce two resources to you. So one that is free and one that is a McGill Library resource. But I wanted to start with the Internet Archive, and that's where we saw Jacquelyn showed the Victorian knitting manuals. So a lot of all of these images that we've seen already are available for free in Internet Archive. And it's a really interesting site. And I've got the address at the bottom, which is just archive.org. But they started archiving the internet in 1996. And they have archived over 600 billion web pages. But they expanded to also include books and audio recordings, videos, images, even software programs. So if you want to play some old DOS software games, this is where you would come. But it's a great place to search and find knitting books. So they have over 20 million freely downloadable books and texts. And I just did a search for knitting books from Ann Budd, Kay Fassett, Elizabeth Zimmerman that we see here. And all of the books came up that were readily available to read, but they also have more than 2 million modern ebooks. So this is a lending library where you can create a free login. So anyone can create a free login on Internet Archive and then run a search and read those freely available books from wartime, but also just borrow more modern knitting books. So sometimes it's just for an hour or two, but you can renew them. But yeah, it's a great resource. And it's a great place to find books from all different libraries. So I did want to introduce this as the first very free place, wonderful place to come and find all of these old patterns and to explore. And the next slide here is actually a more modern place to find magazines. So at McGill Library, we subscribe to something called Press Reader, and it has magazines and newspapers from around the world in many different languages. And it's kind of a fascinating place to come and explore. And I just did a quick search for knitting magazines, and there are crochet and embroidery and cross stitch. And it has a nice app that you can put on your tablet or phone, and you can explore patterns from modern day knitting magazines. So it's one of the resources I would recommend. And on the next slide is what we actually recommended today for newer knitters, but really for all knitters, are patterns by Tin Can Knits. And that is a collaboration between two Canadian designers. And what they've done is created this free set of 12 simple patterns that have sweaters, they have scarves and hats and socks, and it's a really great resource. And they provide all kinds of pattern support as well, with tutorials and instructions for knitting these patterns. And so we've sort of recommended that you take a look at the wheat scarf pattern today. And I've brought with me, for my part, when we do in the breakout rooms for show and tell, I've got maybe a dozen patterns that of things that I've knit from them for show and tell. And I'll be here for some pattern support. But really, it's one of the resources that we wanted to recommend as well, especially if you are new to knitting. Great.
I'm going to unmute. I'll explain the next step, but one thing that we didn't make a slide of, but is worth a mention, and is the online knitting community Ravelry. For those of you who are already part of it, we're speaking to the converted. I'm seeing some nodding faces from the crowd. And it's a great resource these days. It's a very searchable database of patterns, yarns, and different knitting crafts as well. So that one we'll provide a follow-up link, and you can find all of the Tin Can Knits patterns on that community as well. Hello, everyone. So now you have the option of turning on your video, and you can do so if you want. What I'm going to be doing is showing you a guided tour through some of the things in our collections. So I'm going to switch my camera now, and you'll be able to see through the document camera, and we'll look at some of these items in closer detail together. So welcome, everyone. We also, I think, can have a chat in this session. So if you do have questions about some of the items, we'll see about getting a conversation going about them. So the first one that you can see here is the palm size. I'm going to pin my video for everybody, actually, just to make sure that everyone can see what I'm looking at. So this is actually the item that I mentioned in the beginning, the palm-sized Victorian reference book. So it really would be pocket-sized, and it's something that Victorian ladies could keep for ready reference. This one is knitting, netting, and crochet. It's got an embossed and stamped cover. The covers are cloth, and the edges are gilt. So it's actually a nice little volume. But this is the one that is actually very difficult to follow. So if any of you have needles and wool with you, you can give these instructions a bit of a go. I'm going to check the focus here. There we go. This one gives you the cast on methods that I mentioned earlier. That's very difficult to follow. So it gives you the standard setup of yarn wrapped around your pinky, under your other fingers, passing it over your forefinger. It gives you basic instructions for knitting stitches, purl stitches, rib, and to cast over or cast, that's what they call yarn over it in this particular manual. This one also includes instructions for netting and also for crochet, but it's very, very sparsely illustrated. You can see there's one tiny image of netting to give you an idea of what the finished fabric would look like. And then there is the stocking pattern that I showed a little bit earlier as well. So here's the size of the finished pattern. It runs over a few pages. It's 3 pages long of dense text, and impossible to translate that on the fly into an image of a finished stocking. But this is the reference material that some women would have had to work with. So at the time, perhaps it would have been useful. Perhaps it would have been a mark of status to have something like this and then to share it with your coterie. The next image if you have questions about any of these materials, you can put messages in the chat once again. So we'll have a chat for this particular breakout. But the next item I'm going to show you is actually a little bit more colorful. This item, which is a little bit shiny, I'll take off the cover so it's a little less glare. This item dates from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And what it is actually, it's rather exciting for those of you who like to crochet, is this was a sample book of crochet cotton from the turn of the 20th century. What this is from Clark's Brilliant Crochet Cotton. And for those of you who do like to crochet, Clark's is a name that's actually quite familiar. Clark's still exists and still makes products. It's now under Coats and Clark, which if you're a sewist, you might recognize that thread. But this one gives you, this would have been distributed to different vendors and stores. And there's small pencil check marks next to some of these colors. And that indicates the ones that a vendor would want to stock, to sell in their shop, or the ones that a person would want to order. It's remarkable to me that the colors are still so vibrant. So that's a testimony to the color and quality of Clark's cotton. At the time, I think, though we haven't talked about crochet as much in today's session, we've been focusing on knitting, but there's another event perhaps we could run at some time in the future looking at the history of crochet patterns as well. But this one, this particular example, it retains its vibrant color. The ones apparently that were popular were in the pinks here, not very much blue, a little bit of red, and the lavender and yellow are the ones that have the pencil checks. So this example, it's actually quite durable. The cardboard, the covers are cardboard, and this one's in remarkably good shape for being over 100+ years old. For those of you who do like to crochet, I like to crochet as well, but I'm more of a knitter. But it's remarkable to see something that's endured that long. It's a testament to the durability of knitted and crocheted goods. The next thing I'm going to show you is another sample book. So looking a little bit at color, 2 examples in a row. This one in the collection, it's part of the main collection. At ROAAR, we have items from a number of different special collections that were collected by a specific donor and donated to the library over the years. This one is from the main collection. It's a sample from Teinture en Paulina, which is a dye company that was actually based here in Montreal and operated out of Quebec and Toronto as well. But this is a color card, and it would give the purchaser a sample of what colors they might expect if they bought these particular dyes. So this one, you can see it's slightly less vibrant, but it's impressive that the color tints have survived the test of time so very well. And little did Ampolina know that we would be looking at perhaps at their sample book 100 years later, but here it is. This one also comes with general dyeing instructions for using it. This one is to dye wool, silk, cotton, or mixed goods. And the general instructions actually say, never attempt to color a light shade over a dark one. Step 1 to dyeing instruction. I have some questions in crochet history session requests, of course. Is the library still accepting donations of old books? Yes, depending on the collection. I'm going to show items from a few different collections today, but the tentative answer is yes, depending on the item and if it matches our collecting priorities. We do, yes, definitely accept donations, both of books and financial, of course, for the preservation of those books. So yes, as I mentioned, this is from Baribot and Fils. here in Montreal. So the next things that I'm going to show you are actually from one specific collection, and that's the Sheila R. Bork collection of children's literature. So this one is actually quite fun. I'm going to lift my camera up a little bit to give you a better image. And this one is called the Mary Frances Knitting and Crocheting Book. And it's from, as I mentioned, the Sheila Bork collection, which is a children's literature collection put together by a Montreal collector, Sheila R. Bork. She was a book collector and historian who generously donated her collection to us over the course of 20 years. Our library is, the ROAAR Collections really is a treasure chest, and it is a public collection. So yes, it's open to the public Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., but you do have to book an appointment because right now the library is open only to McGill community of current faculty and staff, but you can book a special appointment and come in and look at materials in the reading room here. This one is, as I mentioned, from the Bork collection, and Bork, it incorporates a lot of things. Some of them are fairy tales. There's a healthy collection of fables. There's also a period, the golden age of illustration for children's books. It's a period of particular excellence in book illustration throughout Europe and North America. And there's also a very interesting collection of chapbooks in the Bork holdings from the 18th and 19th centuries. And those are small, inexpensive books, some of the earliest books produced for masses in Europe. There's also, and that's where this fits in, many books that document children's education, so educational materials, and that's what this is. So the Mary Frances series was put together by a woman named Jane Eyre Fryer, and she was born in Philadelphia in 1876, and she went to a seminary and graduated with a specialty in domestic art and science. And she taught in that field for a number of years until she married. And after that, she came out with a series of educational books called the Mary Frances books. And that's what this is. It was aimed at a young audience, couching instruction in narrative for a younger crowd. And this one is interesting. It was published in 1918, but it does have photos. And it has step-by-step instruction couched in, as I said, a narrative with familiar characters called, where's a good picture of it? But it's very cute, sort of anthropomorphized characters that teach her how to knit. There's also, which is more useful, step-by-step photo instructions that would help the young girl to actually acquire these skills. Characters introduce the little Mary Frances to the world of the knitting people. So she has some new friends. There's like Woolly Ball and Knit and Knack are her two knitting needle friends. It's illustrated throughout in such a way that it would invite a young learner to actually engage with the story and the narrative. There's a fairy, Fairly Flew, who also helps her to learn the different knitting skills. And throughout the book, there are a number of patterns for doll clothing, knit and crochet, that would give a young knitter a very concise, small project that they could master. So here you can see one for a doll's knitted hood. And it gives you actually a fairly clearly laid out pattern along the lines of those other World War I knitting patterns that Kristen laid out. And I will run through the questions in the chat here, but I'm going to show one other thing. This is once again that very interesting World War I knitted helmet. So there's some, and this one complete with photos, unlike some of the others. So you can see this is scaled down for a doll, but this is the aviator doll's knitted helmet. And it gives you the same familiar things. So it gives you needle recommendations, material, olive, drab, or khaki, color worsted knitting, and directions. It gives you photos, and this is once again one of the little friends who helps the reader navigate their way through the book. Woolly Ball, and I forget what the name of the hank of yarn is. There's a couple questions in the chat about the reading room. McGill students, everyone does need to make an appointment right now to come in and look at things in the ROAAR reading room, but everyone is welcome. You can email a librarian if you have a specific question, and we'll provide contact details for the librarians today and the address to book appointments in the reading room. And I think that's it for now. There's also in this one, which is quite interesting, an entire section on Red Cross knitting. It was published in 1918, so this was the time when those patterns were really taking off. So you can see here the gauge for the Red Cross needles, size 1, 2, and 3. And there were some questions about this in the chat, millimeters versus inches and UK versus US standardization of knitting sizes. You can see the images and the diameters here. The measurements here are given in inches. So it's 1/25,000th of an inch, which is not a unit of measurement that we see very much anymore. But this is 175,000ths of an inch, Red Cross size number 2, and number 3 is 200. If you knock off 2 of those, what would it be? 2/10, 1/5 of an inch would be the size 3, and then the general direction. So there's an entire resource here on all of the common Red Cross patterns. Hot water bottle cover, a bed sock, wristlets, medium-sized socks, a knitted helmet, and there's usually a sweater and a vest. There you go. So there's a nice compilation of the different wartime knitting patterns. Moving on. I wanted to show one example of the almanacs that Kristen showed in a little more detail. These would be very cheaply published. This is from the ROAAR collection of the library that specializes in the history of medicine here at the library. And this one, there's a convenient hole in the top corner here. And this would have been encouraged, this message here, hang me up. It was made to be hung by that hole as a ready reference. It's full of useful information like weather, forecasts, dream interpretations. This one is put out specifically by this particular company, Dr. Morse's Indian Root Pills. And what they were is really a publicity tool. It's a pamphlet full of testimonials on how Dr. Morse's medication cured their problems for the bowels or whatever. But this also, during the war years, included knitting patterns. And this one, I think, if I find the right page, continued from page 12. There you go. We can look a little bit. So there's the seaman stocking pattern. Long stocking started here on this sort of columnar newspaper layout that continues over the page here. Where did it go? There we go. So married in there between testimonials for your liver cure and the weather forecast for June 1942, you could accurately get a pattern to knit seaman stockings. It gives you the color, wool, needles, measurements, tension. It gives you round by round instructions. So this would have been readily available and hung up in many a drugstore and home kitchen available to people. In some ways, it's the pharmaceutical advertisements of today, but packaged with a knitting pattern. I am going to show one more Red Cross themed content. This was a publication that came out, the Queen's Book of the Red Cross. This came out in 1939 with a message from Her Majesty the Queen. And there is, in fact, I think it was mass produced, but it is a letter from Elizabeth to all of you who buy my book, as well as the distinguished authors and artists who prepared are helping forward the great work of mercy on the battlefield. To all of you, I would send this Christmas message, God bless you. So this one comes with kind words from the Queen, but there is a section entirely on, once again, the knitting forces. This was written by Mrs. Mary Thomas, who is quite well known in the needlewoman world at the time. I have another one of her books here that I'll show you shortly. And that's a great question regarding the paid advertisement by the Red Cross. And that's one I actually don't have an answer to, but would be a great research question to track down in other comparable almanacs. So if anyone's interested, there are more to look at in that collection. This is an example, though, of a complete sort of 1939 illustrated manual for knitters from Mary Thomas. It once again has the familiar patterns of the Red Cross knitting, but it also has some other ones that you wouldn't expect, such as a knitted vase. This is a Victorian piece and the kind of work at which sailors excel. The shape fits over any tumbler or a jam jar. So you could have a decorative knitted vase if you wanted to. A knitted bag and the like. Kristen is actually developing a pattern. There's a follow-up event to this one on March 9th. Sugar and thread and there's a follow-up to this one called Knitting in Code. So she's going to flex her historian muscles and be looking in more detail at the World War II content, I think in particular. And I'm running out of time. We're going to rejoin the main session. But thank you for looking into the collections a little bit with me. And I do invite you all, if you are curious and want to see more materials, to send an email. I'll put this in the chat, but we'll send a follow-up with it as well. This next one that I'll show, that woman who wrote that chapter, she has an entire series of books on different handicraft topics. This one is actually from our circulating collection at the library, the Blackadder-Lauderman Collection of Art and Architecture. And there's an entire book on embroidery for the interested from, what date's this one? 1936 was the first edition. So predates the Queen's book, but her series clearly brought her to the attention of the people who were compiling the Queen's book in 1939. So there's some very interesting techniques for those of you out there who are doing needlework today instead of knitting while you attend. There's some interesting patterns, reference work, and a very interesting snapshot in time back to this period of embroidery. So that's Mary Thomas. Now we're going to go back in time, away from hand knitting for a moment, just because this is so interesting. This is actually knitting a catalog for knitting machines. And this is from our commercial catalog collection. This one dates from about 1918. And in the catalog collection, there's a wide range of things: Eaton's catalogs, hat catalogs, local producers of many things. This one is in particular for knitting machines. And for all of you out there who are enthusiastic knitters, this is the tagline that gets your attention, right? How to make money by knitting. The timeless message that we'd all like to do, right? But yes, this is a catalog of knitting machines. So away from hand knitting, but just fascinating. I know that April actually does have a knitting machine that dates from the 1980s, so a little later than this one. But it gives you an interesting price point comparison of what would have been available to people at the time. Because machine knitting, of course, changed things enormously in the 20th century. But yes, there it would have been, the moneymaker ribbing machine for circular knitting. So that's just a little detour. And our library really is a treasure chest, and this one sparkles. I love children's literature, and I'm a student of it over the time. And there's a lot of fairy tales, fables, and instructional materials aimed at children. This one I pulled out actually because it's related once again to Clark's thread. This is an advertising pamphlet for Clark's trade myland mark of spool of cotton. And it's a little story. It's a pamphlet and also an instructional manual that would give children the alphabet, while giving their parent, I suppose, an advertisement for Clark's cotton, as well as a story. And there it is, once again, Clark's myland cotton. So we have some ephemera and items in the collection that are not necessarily what come up when you search for knitting in the catalog, but are of interest anyways to trace the history of the fibers and the ways that people would hear about them and ways that people would buy them as well. So that's one sample from Burke, the Little Fisherman. One other item from the Sheila Burke collection. This one is called Paco Goes to the Fair. And I chose to show it partly because the representation of the process of spinning is really, really lovely and quite accurate. So this one is called Paco Goes to the Fair, a story of faraway Ecuador. It was published in 1940, once again, part of the Burke collection. And it's a story that takes place in Ecuador, and they go looking for wool. And it really documents the process of spinning fibers in a beautifully illustrated way. It's very, it's, what is it, 4-tone printing? So it's not full color, but an interesting printing process nonetheless. But it shows this process of spinning. There's a number of illustrations to show the actual process from alpaca wool to market, and using a different kind of dye. Apparently Paco in the story gets in trouble for using the wrong dye on his father's special wool. So this red is the problematic color. But it's an interesting example because it shows that these is a marker of the fact that Peruvian and South American fibers were becoming more well-known and coming to market in North America. So an interesting influx. I do like knitting with alpaca myself, but there's a photo of the finished wool as well, a nice red. So another sample from the Sheila Burke collection. Hello and welcome back to the main session, everyone. I hope that you learned something in your breakout rooms. I know I did too. I see Kristen still working with wool there. So thank you everyone for coming to today's session. I do have a couple of final notes, but we will open it up for questions or discussion. If you have questions you want to pose that we haven't covered in one of the breakouts, you can put them in the chat now, and we can discuss those as a big group. But I just do want to throw up one more screen share, because I want to extend a special invitation. We are going to have another knitting event here. Up next is actually an artist talk on February 23rd with artist Amy Wu. And she's talking about steganography, which is the art of hiding a message in plain sight. And that's a good segue because our next knitting event is on March 9th. And that is called Knitting in Code. And you can come back and learn more from Kristen, who's flexing her historian muscles and looking more into the practice of knitting in code. So that one's going to be on March 9th. And let me just double check I've got the right thing here. Yes, there it is. So yes, knitting in code is, if anyone is interested, there it is. So if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat now. One that came up is I did try and parse our 1844 instructions for casting on, and I was not successful.
I was wondering if it was a long tail cast on.
I think, Kristen, you're still muted.
Oh.
And I think that might be a permissions. Let me just check.
Is it working now? No.
I hear you.
It might be that
Okay.
Michelle has to make you a co-host once again.
Okay, April, I was thinking it might be a long tail cast on. That's what I was thinking when I was.
I have to say, April, I was so impressed with the speed at which you put together test patterns for the wheat pattern. I have a small son and I'm not as fast a knitter as I once was. So well done, and thank you for putting in the work on that front.
I cannot. So I see that Mary asked a question when knitting, which is the back side and which is the front side. And that is a slightly complicated question that depends on what you're knitting. So in modern patterns, a lot of times the pattern will say right side and wrong side. And usually the right side is the front side. So like the front of my sweater. And then the wrong side is the back side. And the easiest way to tell the difference when you are starting to learn to knit is to use a safety pin and to put it on the side that the pattern tells you is the front side. That way, when you turn it around, you put it away, you put it in the bag, you put it on the counter, you come back to it, you know that the side with the safety pin is the front side, is the right side. And so that's my suggestion about that. But it does depend on the pattern and the item itself. And a lot of times things like the wheat pattern are reversible. So, you know, there is no real front side or back side, and it just depends on which one you like better.
And it's often the odd number side.
Yes.
So if it didn't say right side, wrong side, it will be that odd number is the right one and the even is the wrong. But yeah, the wheat was great because both sides are identical. So you don't have to worry about it.
One question that came to my mind is I prefer to knit with circular knitting needles for everything. And I wondered, I'm not sure if either of you know, I don't know when that innovation was introduced, because knitting pins, the double pointed needles, were the common tool for knitting projects in the round in the Victorian era and early 20th century. But do you know when circular needles kind of appeared and started to become popular?
So I've tried to look into this a little bit, and although it seems like there were some even earlier versions, that the kind of like plastic cable that we are more used to having in our circulars is kind of like an early 20th century invention. Linda says they've been discussing this on Ravelry. I need to find that forum so I can learn more, because I was trying to figure this out. But for a long time, most people really did just prefer double pointed, especially because with double pointeds, they can be as long as you want them to be. And I've actually seen Renaissance paintings of women knitting tops with double pointed needles. Can you imagine like the whole girth of you on double pointeds? I can't imagine.
Wow. And these days, yes, circular needles come in bamboo, in wood. You can buy interchangeable tips, so you can screw the needle of your preference onto your cable. But I think it would be quite overwhelming to actually knit a sweater on double pointed needles.
There's a great documentary on the NFB on the Cowichan sweaters, how they're knit, and they use needles.
And there's a mention in the chat there of Coast Salish knitting with long double pointed needles. Yeah.
And I have a friend who learns to knit in Norway, and she was astounded when she saw a circular needle with a cord, and she was knitting like color work yokes on double pointeds, and I was just like, oh my gosh. I can't imagine.
And it's an interesting, there's a follow-up question on Magic Loop. And a lot of these discussions, as somebody else pointed out, there are forums on Ravelry that you can go deep into this. One of the interesting things is to try and envision how women would have used these early manuals. So looking at more of the resources from the Southampton collection, those Victorian knitting manuals might be an interesting exercise to just try and, from reading the instructions, set up your fingers and hands the way that they use the yarn or that sort of thing. It's actually quite hard, I found. And I know that there are people and YouTubers you can follow who do this. But it's an interesting exercise to try and figure out, from written instructions only with no visuals, how to set up your yarn.
We had a question in our group about when the gauge swatch would have historically been talked about or done.
I would love to know that too. I'm not sure, because when we look at the patterns that we've looked at that start to include gauge, we don't have the 4x4 inch square yet, or the 10x10 inch centimeter. So these are some things that I would just love to look into, you guys. And
well, it's something that further research is needed. So if you want to start digging into more historical patterns and trying to see when those trends appear, there's a wealth of resources at collections like McGill's and others elsewhere, complementary collections, because searching through things in our collections is kind of like sifting through to find the relevant materials. They come from all over the place. So some from the Burke collection, some from the WWII Library of the History of Medicine, some from our regular main rare books collection, and of course all those great resources that April shared from contemporary publications and 20th century things on Press Reader and the Internet Archive. There's so much material to go through. So thank you everyone for sharing your lunch hour with us and joining this session, and for being so active in the chat and taking part. It's very much appreciated. Knitting tutors for pay at McGill. That's an interesting question. Well,
perhaps I should get a side hustle.
When I'm on the reference desk, you can bring your knitting and I will help you.
There was one question actually about Victorian women and that shift towards a more for-profit model of like, how did women start to make money with knitting? And that's a complementary research question that I would love somebody to explore. Interesting. But I do have to say a few thank yous. So an enormous thank you to Kristen, to April, and to Michelle for helping today's session run smoothly. Thank you to everyone who attended. And also, yes, happy Valentine's, for sharing your Valentine's Day with us. I also have to thank our sponsors. We run these public events because of the support of 2 private donors and whose funds enabled us to apply for a SSHRC a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant. So Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley, private donors who gave gifts of funds to the library that let us match our application funds from SSHRC. So thanks to them for making these events possible, and thanks to you all for coming. We're going to sign off there. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour. And yes, we hope to see you at either March 9th for Knitting and Code or on the 23rd for steganography and coded communication with artist Amy Sowu. Thank you everyone for such an engaging chat and a great time. Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.